There's different kinds of nationalism, from the sort of rather warm, embracing, welcoming sense of folkloric nationalism that can be just as damaging and worrying as the more formal, excluding and totalitarian nationalism that comes at the other end of the spectrum. So I was looking to you for definitions, Shirley. What do you think?
Well, thank you very much, Jude. Let me begin with the kind of nationalism that represented the end of the great Victorian age and the beginning of the Edwardian age. And I suppose that most of us would think, at least in Britain, of Edward Elgar as being really the symbol of that whole period. His music is broad and generous and deep and quite obviously patriotic, especially the pomp and circumstance sets, which everybody in Britain can still probably more or less learn by heart. It was indeed, I think, the music of imperialism. It wasn't limited just to these islands or just to the people of these islands. It was much broader than that. And of course, if you look at some of his other work, it relates directly to other parts of the United Kingdom, particularly Ireland and Scotland. And on top of all that, I think it's fair to say that he lived at the peak of the time of imperialism, which then descended quite quickly before the First World War and was effectively destroyed, although it took some time to die, by the First World War. And one of the things I find very touching is, those of you who've heard it, that beautiful lament called For the Fallen, which Elgar wrote after the First World War, which said almost the opposite of what Pomp and Circumstance had said before it. It's a very moving piece and well worth listening to. It reminds one in some ways of The Dream of Gerontius, which was written much earlier, but it has some of that kind of deep perception of suffering that characterised, I think, both works. You then come to the second definition of nationalism, which is a rather, what Jude has referred to, in a sense it's a rather tender kind of patriotism. One would almost more describe it as a love of home. And the composers she's been referring to, like Janacek and to some extent Ravel, and possibly even Dvorak, because people forget that when Dvorak wrote the New World Symphony, he was living in a tiny village in the Middle West, surrounded by his fellow refugees who'd come, as Dvorak had, from Eastern Europe. So that it wasn't, as it were, a complete divorce of somebody who'd left his country behind and adopted another one, although he loved and was bowled over in some ways by America. But he never forgot where he came from, and he basically lived in a community that represented what had been his fellow countrymen. The third kind of nationalism is, again, I think, quite a touching one, which is the sense of belonging. That certainly characterised this group of composers we just talked about, who drew upon the folk music of their own country, the culture of their own country, or even their community. But this third group are people who are very conscious of belonging to a community, not necessarily a country. And I want to emphasise that. A lot of the work of people who wrote music in Scotland or Ireland was directed to being members of the place that they lived in. It was not about the UK. Perhaps they wouldn't have wanted it to be about the UK, but it was really essentially about where they lived. Some of the French composers who lived in the Languedoc, which had its own language, didn't reflect imperial France. They reflected the folk music. You know, some of it, of course, is still very popular. The area around the area of the Pyrenees, where you get some of those lovely songs that we often listen to from that particular region, not from France as such. And the final one, the one that I suppose we all stumble over, the terrible one, is of course the patriotism of sheer nationalism. I've tried to distinguish nationalism of these different pieces because they're not all the nationalisms of Mussolini or of Hitler. But when I get to that kind of nationalism, a nationalism which replaces almost religious fervour about the nation, which can be an artificial nation, you then have a base for fanaticism, I think, and for extremism, which does not necessarily, and not indeed usually, characterise those earlier groups I talked of. Let me turn just for a moment, because I want to hear Jude comment on this very much, on Mussolini and even more on Hitler. Mussolini was not particularly inclined to use dogmatic views about how people should play music. He was a bit inclined to be nationalistic, but he put up with a great deal of different kinds of music in Italy. at least as far as the Italians were concerned, Mussolini was undoubtedly a very, very much more, how can I put it, benevolent dictator than Hitler. Hitler, sadly one has to say, is the one member of all this group of either dictators or totalitarian leaders, or in some cases very conservative elected leaders, like Baldwin, for example, who was a passionate lover of music. It was said about Hitler when he was elected in 1933 by the greatest composer of Germany and Austria-Hungary at the time, who I suppose was the most popular anyway, who was, of course, Richard Strauss. Richard Strauss said in 1933, "We now, thank God, at last have a Reichsführer who loves the arts." And Hitler made a very strong impact on the composers of Germany, not least through his absolutely obsessive adoration of Wagner and all his works. Hitler couldn't stand Wagner being badly performed. In some cases, he would walk out publicly. He would also insist that people who sang Wagner were people of whom he approved, mostly fine Aryans. But some, unfortunately from the point of view of Hitler, had Jewish traits. They were partly Jewish. And one of the most interesting stories on that front, a tragic story really, Richard Strauss was writing a new opera based upon a Ben Jonson play called The Silent Woman. And on the notices that advertised the opera, the name of the librettist, Stefan Zweig, was given full coverage by Richard Strauss. Stefan Zweig was already extremely famous. He wrote wonderful stories and marvellous literature. But he was partly Jewish. It was disastrous. The opera was played once only. Hitler, who was meant to be there, wasn't. Goebbels, who was meant to be there, wasn't. Both of them discovered in a few days before the opera was performed that Stefan Zweig was a librettist, and the opera was never played again as long as Hitler remained in power in Germany. It lasted for just one day and then was finished off. So you had really the basis of a very intense clash. But sadly, in Germany, as distinct from some of the other countries, particularly the Scandinavians, there was no real opposition from the composers to their new leader, their leader. Not in the way there was undoubtedly in Russia, with people like Shostakovich managing to get across little private messages. Anyway, end of my remarks. Sorry, they went on a bit too long. But I do want to ask Jude if she would say a bit about why she thinks, because it's something that's played on my mind a lot, why was it that when writers like Thomas Mann stood up bravely and firmly against Hitler's rule in Germany, and people like Rainer van Rilke, the poet, wrote excellent poems about the disaster of the First World War for Germany and so on, why was it the composers were the least likely of all to stand up, with ultimately Richard Strauss even agreeing to be the chairman of the Reichsmusikkammer, the chamber music limited to people approved of by Hitler and his immediate group around him? What was it? Was it abstraction from the world of politics which I live in, or what was it?
Fear, obviously, is a big part of this, isn't it? I don't think that artists, much as they would like to think they are perhaps, I'm not sure that artists are braver people, more courageous people, even more principled people than anybody else. Art makes its statements normally in contexts where there isn't danger. It says dangerous things in safe spaces. The interesting thing about art is when the place is dangerous, how does the art survive? I don't think it was just the composers, by the way, who were complicit. There were many artists who stayed in Germany and carried on working. And I think that some of them were anti-Semitic. Some of them did see Hitler as supporting the idea of culture and art in a way that probably meant that they were closing their eyes to the reality of what was happening until it was too late. They had families, they had kids in schools, you know, all the normal sort of stuff. But I also think that there was real nationalism amongst some of those composers. They wanted Germany to be fantastic. They believed in that.
Alex Ross actually quotes what I find an absolutely chilling remark by Weiben, which is to the effect that I can hardly bear the excitement. Each day is more exciting than the next, talking about living under the Reich.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting one, because Weiben was clearly anti-Semitic. Mm-hmm. He came from quite a sort of aristocratic background. I think people don't know whether he was a naive, romantic, sort of head-in-the-clouds aesthete,
right,
who, sided rather immaturely with the idea of this great opportunity of Germany, or whether he really knew what he was doing. And
yes, he may.
He might have just been stupid. And also, let's just talk about flattery for a minute, political flattery. It's not very long ago that I think we witnessed a lot of people in the arts in this country being incredibly flattered to be invited through the doors of Number 10. And that happens a lot. People get sucked into circles of power and they're thrilled to be there. So I think this is another element that composers, artists, they join an elite alongside scientists, economists, business people, and they compromise because they're human.
But one of the factors that one has to then, I think, tease out is the nature of the change in who are patrons. And if one goes all the way back to the 18th century, or for that matter, people like Bach and so on, the patrons are either a princeling or the church. But in either case, the patron who keeps them going and gives them a social round and all the rest of standing is less offensive than he becomes when he or she becomes in the 20th century. I mean, the 18th century patrons are on the whole reasonably benevolent, as far as one can tell. Even the 19th century patrons are reasonably benevolent, and you can go wheel all the way back to the 16th century and 15th century and look at the ways in which the papacy conducted its huge patronage, which on the whole, although they objected to some things, and they didn't like the beginning of Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel because of the nakedness of the figures, but they weren't anything like as censorious as much later state patrons became in the 20th century. I think what I want to do is pick out the 20th century as a period of particularly conditional patronage compared to earlier centuries, because we tend to think we're moving forward, and in some ways we are, but in some ways we really aren't.